In the summer of 2018, I was in a long-distance relationship. Not that long. He only lived about 4 hours away. That was pretty serious, but also pretty new at the time. My boyfriend, who had driven those 4 hours to see me on every break we had from school, essentially begged me to come visit him at his grandmother's house. I didn't have a car at the time, but I really wanted to impress him and show my dedication to the relationship by going to visit him. So I dropped some coin on a Greyhound bus, and I was excited to meet up with him. At first, everything seemed fine. I took a seat at the back of the bus because I didn't really want to speak to anyone, but the bus was pretty full, so inevitably, this guy sat down next to me. No red flags, just seemed like a regular guy in maybe his late 20s or early 30s. So I put my earbuds in and just ignored him. Before I continue, I'd like to highlight some character flaws of mine at the time that this happened. When I was 18, I was an extremely non-judgmental person and tended to see the best in people, even to a fault. This tends to land me in very bad and sometimes dangerous situations. At 18, I simply didn't know any better and kind of overlooked potentially concerning actions. There was a guy in the seat in front of us who would not stop talking to no one in particular, but he was facing a girl in the next set of seats across from him. Again, I didn't want to judge. Maybe he had some type of mental problem he couldn't help, and he wasn't doing any harm. So I ignored him too and continued to stare out the window, listening to music. That is, until he turned around and stared at me. Now, I might have been naive, but not stupid. A chill ran through my spine as I made eye contact with this man. He had these cold, callous eyes, and his skin lacked so much saturation, it looked like he had been covered in dust. I take out my earbuds and he immediately turns to the guy next to me, and they engage in conversation. I was really set on edge when I overheard them discussing how they were both ex-convicts that recently got out of prison. Remember, me being non-judgmental, I figured maybe they served prison time for something that was minor, giving their access to a public bus. I'm not sure how all that works, obviously. They don't do a background check for a Greyhound bus, but still, I try not to think anything of it. The man in front of us turns to me now, and I can't remember exactly what he said, but he called me baby, which kind of freaked me out, but I couldn't say I wasn't used to it. I figured it was just another grown creep hitting on me. Annoyed, I put my earbuds back in and ignored him until the bus stopped at a rest stop. Most of the people got off, including the guy next to me, leaving just me and the guy in front of me in the back of the bus. He asked if I would come up and sit next to him to make friendly conversation, and my dumbass actually did it. Keep in mind, I was 18 and unfathomably stupid, and I also lacked the gut feeling that something was wrong. He starts telling me that he just got out of prison and hadn't seen a woman in a long time. I said something along the lines of, "That's unfortunate," and inched away from him. He scooted over to me so that our legs were touching, and that's when my heart rate really started to pick up. The next thing I know, his hands are on me. He wrapped them around my waist and went on about how small I was, then commented about how it had been so long since he last touched a woman. I was paralyzed. I had no idea what to do. He kept going on about how I should be a model while continuing to grope me. Again, I was absolutely terrified and couldn't bring myself to move. Soon enough, everybody got back on the bus, including the guy who sat next to me, who shot the other man a weird look that prompted him to let me go. I scrambled out of that seat and still sat behind him, not knowing what to do, but feeling safer that other people were on the bus. He didn't bother me again after that, so I just prayed it would stay that way. It gets worse. The bus stops at another rest stop, and this time I get off, not wanting to be stuck in there again. I'm just chilling, as much as one can be chill after something like that, when a girl I recognized from the bus came up to me. "Hey, that guy that was talking to you just left in a car, but is circling the building. He keeps leaving and then coming back. I'm sorry I didn't say anything earlier." I thanked her for the warning, put a hoodie on in 85-degree weather, and flipped up the hood so he wouldn't see me get back on the bus. Luckily, I never saw him again. I was too embarrassed to tell anyone what had happened, due to my lack of competence and general understanding of how the world can be. When I met up with my boyfriend, I gave him very vague details, wanting to forget it ever happened. But now I don't think that's possible. When I was 20, I had moved from Baltimore to the Eastern Shore, thinking the distance would help mitigate my habit. It didn't. Instead, I just ended up driving to Baltimore every couple of days and buying several $100s worth of H, instead of just buying less on a daily basis. In the process, I got to know a lot of odd people, some of them hacks. In Baltimore, a hack is someone who operates as a cabbie illegally. Often they take people into the city to pick up their drugs, or just charge half the rate of a legit cab driver. I had met an older guy at a Dunkin' Donuts in Dundalk who did this. Now, I wasn't in the habit of using hacks, but one night, my ride went down a one-way street, the wrong way in front of a police officer, and we were pulled over and searched. Ends up, the idiot had brought his stash of pot with him, so we were arrested and sent to BCDC. I was pissed. Around midnight that night, they released me. It ends up that not only had my friend admitted ownership of the marijuana, but the reason they'd used to search us was that his license was showing up as suspended was bull, and my friend's lawyer had called them on it. So there I was, in the middle of Baltimore City with no ride, nowhere to go, dope sick, in the middle of December. They released the men and women separately, and my friend's cell phone was still off at the time when I tried to call it. It ends up that he had been released several hours earlier, but had left his phone in the truck. For anyone that hasn't had the pleasure of being arrested, they impound your vehicle. So if you are unlucky enough to get processed and released after 5 p.m. or before 8 a.m., you're out of luck, re-getting your vehicle back. Not to mention, another couple $100s in the hole. As I mentally ran through my list of options, I remember the hack I'd met earlier that week, and decided to give him a try. I figured that at the least, if he was still awake, I could pay him to help me cop and drop me off at a Greyhound bus station to wait out the night. Well, I called, and not only was he up and about, but he was also only about a 10-minute drive away from where I was being released. The fact that he was still up, and about at 1 in the morning, may have given normal people pause. I just assumed he was probably a crackhead, tweaker or some such, and wrote it off his luck. Within half an hour he showed up, and I clambered into the long gray sedan, just grateful to be out of the cold and back on the solid ground. Now, to give you an idea of the way this guy came off, the best way I can think to describe him is gray. Everything about him was just gray. His vehicle was a medium, dinged up gray, his hair was longish, and a deep solid gray. Even his pallor seemed gray. I remember he had the face of a postmenopausal woman. Sort of jowly, if you know what I mean. Soft, in retrospect. The guy was creepy as hell. At the time, he just seemed unexceptional. In reality, and really in the drug world, there are so many weird people that you're forced to deal with on a daily basis, that unless someone comes off as blatantly volatile, you eventually learn to just ignore the crazy. If you don't, you'll drown in it. We managed to cop in Baltimore. There's always someone out. I asked the guy to take me to the Greyhound station. Just wanted to get well and to curl up till I could think about catching a bus. He sort of just looked at me, looked down, looked back up, then asked if I just wanted to go watch TV at his place till the buses began running. Looking back, I remember feeling a bit hesitant, but the man seemed so unexceptional, such a non-entity that I couldn't imagine him being a threat. And if I'm being entirely honest, I just wanted a clean, warm place to get it on. I was well beyond dope sick at this point, and all my consuming thought was just to get straight. Taking my silence for hesitation, I remember him telling me not to worry. He wasn't going to try anything. I ought maybe to have mentioned that I'm a 5'6", 100-pound female, 20 years old at the time, and that the bus station wasn't the safest place for a tiny woman like myself to be hanging out at 2 o'clock in the morning. And that he was just trying to help. Well, F me, but I thanked him, said sure, and we proceeded to drive out towards the county. To this day, I'm still not sure what direction we'd even gone in, just that wherever it was he lived. It was about a half an hour outside the city, and that it was, not in the woods, but in a heavily wooded area. As we neared his house, he started acting a bit strange. Not enough to set off the alarm bells yet, but still. I'll never forget him saying that either the police chief of that county or the chief's son lived in the same cul-de-sac that he did. They were friends, and that the guy had helped him out of what he termed a few predicaments. The house was right on a lake with a dock in the backyard. I had no idea what county this was in, and no one I've tried describing it to has ever been able to pinpoint it either. It was totally alien to me. He pulled into his driveway, and I was shocked to see that his house was closer to being a mansion than the hovel I'd assumed I was in for. He would go on to tell me, as he parked and we walked up to the door, that it had belonged to his mother, who had recently passed away. Here's this ratty little man with a ratty little car and his ratty little clothes, and he's living in this extremely well, not nice, but expensive house. Driving around all day and night for pocket change, and basically living at a Dunkin' Donuts. I was more than a bit skeptical. When we went inside, the situation became even stranger, but at the least, more familiar. More in line with what I'd seen of the guy so far. The house was covered in two things: dust and knickknacks. And when I say covered, I mean it. Every square inch of surface space was covered in tacky little porcelain angels and dollar store crap. Shelves, tables, the top of the ginormous old box television, and even the kitchen was covered in them. The kitchen itself, I only saw for a brief moment, but I'll never forget how even the sink was filled with things. There were the obligatory dollies that all old people seem to have in spades, all of them coated in dust and discolored. I asked where the bathroom was and excused myself to go get high. I was getting pretty weirded out by this point and just wanted to get straight so I could decide what to do. I did my thing and went back to the living room, which was the first room you walked into when you came in the door. I didn't want to go any deeper into the house. I wanted to take a look at the lock on the door, create an exit strategy, and hope I didn't really need one. I was quickly dashed. The first thing the guy did was bring me a glass of water and a handful of pills. Puzzled, I asked him what the pills were for. He said, to sleep. Now it's 3 a.m. at this point, and I have to be at the bus station by 6. At most, we have maybe 2 hours before we will have to leave. I told him I don't think it's a good idea, since falling asleep isn't on the agenda, that we don't have time for even a quick nap. Well, he starts to become pretty insistent that I take the pills. Believe me, if we weren't so out in the middle of nowhere, not to mention it being December and bitter cold, at this point I'd have booked. Instead, I sort of laughed and took 2 of the pills out of his hand, stuck them in my mouth and took a sip of water, saying, well, what the hell. Immediately he brightened and shuffled off to give me another glass of water, which I requested. Looking back, I shouldn't even drink the bloody water. I'm an idiot. I spit out the pills and then shoved them in the seat of the sofa. This whole time we'd been talking about little things. Baltimore, local politics, music, nothing deep. At this point he starts asking me about chemicals, about drugs. Specifically what sort of drugs will knock someone out, but not harm them. How much you would need of what for someone to say, tiny like myself. I try to act as if this is entirely normal conversation. At this point, it seemed to me that my existence depended on me not registering how abnormal the entire situation was. I think my thought process at the time, and especially as time went on, you'll see what I mean shortly, was that I couldn't act as if I knew what was going on. That I couldn't act as if there was anything strange or alarming occurring. That he would be stupid to let me leave and let me live if he knew that I knew exactly what was going on here. That I need to seem like a non-threat. The whole time we were having this discussion, by the way, the guy kept trying to get behind me. At one point he succeeded and started rubbing my shoulders. I just laughed, said I wasn't a fan of massages, and that I needed to run to the bathroom. When I came back, I made sure to sit on the sofa that was against the wall. And I'm looking around for a phone, but I don't want to ask for one, because I don't want him to know that my cell phone is dead. Yeah, another great stroke of luck. My cell phone had died about 5 minutes after I'd called the creep to come pick me up. Now this whole time the guy has been pacing around the living room, sitting for a few minutes, only to get back up again, walk back and forth a bit, and sit back down. He began talking about his mother, how she collected these knickknacks, and how she died from a heart attack or a stroke. Now he'd been thinking about renovating the house, but hadn't had the heart to make any changes to anything yet. So he says he wants to show me something. He wants to show me the upstairs. Why I didn't run screaming out of that place, I don't know. I think part of me was still very much hoping that I was misreading the situation. That the guy was just lonely and creepy and socially awkward, not actually dangerous or anything. But here we have yet one more horror film trope coming into play. Creepy obsession with mother and bizarre dust-filled house, perfectly preserved in memory of mom, down to the last glass she used still sitting on the kitchen table. I shit you not. Now the guy wants to show me the upstairs. He wants to show me her room. So I follow him upstairs. First he makes it obvious he wants me to go up before him, but I wasn't having any of that. We get to the second story. There were 3, I never made it to the third, however. I turn off down this hallway, and he opens the first door on the left, goes in, half expecting to see the body of his dead mom lying on the bed or something, and find myself seriously relieved when I find myself standing in just one more dust-coated room full of crap. I don't remember much about the room. I remember the bed was made, and that I couldn't tell if the comforter was dark, or just covered in so much dust that it appeared that way. He gestured for me to sit down. I obliged. What followed was the worst of the experience. He sat down on the end of the bed next to me and began talking about his mother. After a bit, he looked at me and said, "You are so beautiful. You look like a little girl. I bet little girls really like you." I tried to lead the conversation back to his mom. He gets up and walks over to the far wall of the bedroom, starts referring to our earlier conversation about drugs and knocking someone out. He asks me what I would use to knock out a child, what I would use to keep a child knocked out for long periods of time, safely. I'm trying at this point to act as if I'm still on point, as if I'm not finding this line of conversation to be dreadful, creepy, and horrible. I tell him that I really don't know. I'm just a dope fiend, not a chemist. He asks about heroin and if that would be safe. At this point, I've just had it, and I think he can tell. He says, "I want to show you something." I begin to protest, to tell him that I have to use the restroom, but he insists. He pushes on the cheap wood paneling on the wall, and a large square of it swings open. He gestures inside, says he's been working on it for a few years, that it's just big enough for a small woman, but made for a child. It's a sort of cot, and there are loops on the ends. For rope or some other restraint, I'm sure. I noped out of the bedroom, down the stairs. I didn't run, I just told him I had to go to the restroom again. While I am walking, shaking down the stairs, I pull my cell phone out of my purse and mimic dialing it. I was lucky that he stayed behind to close up the bedroom and that thing in the wall, so he didn't see that my phone was even turning on. I pretended to be having a conversation with a friend of mine, and at that point, he showed up, began loudly recounting what had transpired that evening to my friend. I then pretended that my friend had offered to come pick me up from the bus stop. And in one respect, I was lucky. The guy I knew was living out of town, but he didn't know I was living 4 hours away, or that any friend of mine would have to make that hellishly long trip if they were going to come pick me up. I told my friend that I'd head out to the bus station ASAP, and that I'd see him soon. I still remember the look on that guy's face as I said that. It darkened. You know the look that snotty, spoiled little kids will get when someone actually dares to tell them no? It was like that. It was that look, but worse. Because there was something almost perverse about seeing it so openly displayed on the face of a 50-something-year-old man. So I started to grab my purse and zip up my coat, all the while gibbering on about how my friend remembered him and had said to tell him hi. It seemed at the time that there were two things that were of the utmost importance at the moment. The first, to make him feel that I hadn't found him or anything he'd said or displayed odd. I didn't want him to think that I would be some sort of a threat to his plans or his well-being if he let me leave. Secondly, I wanted him to know that he was identifiable, and that someone, at least, someone who could identify him, knew I was with him. This is pretty much the end of this story, although I have one more, far worse encounter with the same guy a couple of weeks after this incident. He took me to the bus station and acted shitty the entire time we were driving there. The second encounter convinced me that not only was I lucky to be alive, but that I had spent several hours in the home of a serial killer. Do I think he had done anything yet at the time I spent that terrifying early morning in his home? No, I think he was gearing up to, though. And by the second brief encounter I had with the guy, I'm positive he had. I don't know how to put it. That uncertainty he displayed with me was gone. I think by that point he'd crossed the line. If I haven't bored everyone to death and anyone wants to hear about the second encounter, I'll share it. In closing, I will say this. I did take down his license plate number as he was leaving that morning, and I did contact a friend of mine who was a police officer. A year or so after all of this happened, my friend called me and asked if I still had the guy's information. I didn't. He'd lost it, if he'd ever really bothered to write it down at all. There had been several disappearances of young children in the very same areas of that guy, in our second blissfully brief encounter. Mentioned that he trolled, just scoping out the little girls. I did find the man. I began by going to Dunkin' Donuts that he had hung out at. The owner, who said the guy spent every single morning there for a couple of years, told me that he had just quit coming the same week that this happened. I think I finally figured out why he hung out there every morning. The day I went out there looking for the guy, I noticed that there was a bus stop right in front of the Dunkin' Donuts. A bus stop full of elementary school kids. In 2014, I moved to England from Canada to gain work and travel experience and to also find myself. I ended up living in Essex with 3 other roommates. They were all women, all a bit older than I was. I was 24 at the time, Megan was 31, Cherry was 34, and Cassie was 38. Megan was from New York, Cherry from New Jersey, and Cassie from Poland. All 4 of us shared this 3-story flat. The back of our home was the living room and kitchen. The back wall was complete glass that looked out into the garden, and the garden was completely fenced in. The house had an interesting dynamic, to say the least. I have tons of stories from that time in my life. I adored all my roommates except for Cherry. After living with Cherry for 7 months, I was over her antics. One day I came home from work, I locked the door and made myself something to eat and go up to bed. I brought some work home with me. So I'm in my pajamas with all these papers around me and my headphones on jamming out. I had headphones on because Cherry was out to dinner with work friends. That meant booze, and then soon after that, a tantrum was surely to come. I just didn't want to have to listen to her crazy scream crying. I am working away, completely focused, until I feel something. I look up to see a man standing over me. I don't register it right away, and I passively say, "Cherry's room is on the second floor." And I continue to work. Cherry regularly brought strange men home. But he doesn't leave. Again, "Cherry's room is downstairs. You..." He then interrupts. I am not here for Cherry. A cold chill iced my veins. My fight or flight kicked in just then. I start surveying the situation. I look him up and down, and he has a bottle of Prosecco in one hand and a knife in the other. He's about 5'10", wild muddy brown hair and black eyes. He has a light blue polo shirt on, and one side of his collar is popped up in a distinct Manchester accent. Once I focused in, I realized his eyes were black because his pupils were completely dilated. Shit, I was in trouble. I needed an escape plan. Unfortunately, this man was standing in between me and my bedroom door. I needed to get downstairs, but I needed for him to think it was his idea. I decided to play along. Just then, he uses his knife to pop the cork. Prosecco started flowing onto my carpet. I said, "Oh no, let's clean that up. I prefer to drink out of a proper flute anyways." He nodded, replying, "Yeah, you are a proper classy bird. Let's go." Try to act as natural as possible. Try not to show that I am shaking all over, and try to gain control over my breathing. We take the long journey down to the main floor of my flat. All 3 floors. He has the back of my nightie bunched up in one hand, and I could feel the point of the knife graze my back with his other. I was trying to playfully speak with him as we walked down the stairs. I couldn't tell you what I was saying. I was most likely rambling. I couldn't hear anything over my heart beating in my ears. We get to the bottom of the stairs, and there is a hallway to my left that leads to the front door. On my right, which is much closer to us, is the kitchen and living room. We make our way to the kitchen. I point to the cabinets that had the wine glasses. He said he knew where they were and start towards them. I now had the kitchen table in between us. It was time to run. I burst into a sprint down the hallway towards the door. My hands fumble over the locks, shaking and sweating. I swing open the door and see 2 men walking across the street. They must have been walking home from the train. There was a big train station in front of our home. I call out to them for help, and suddenly I am flung onto the ground. Little pebbles piercing my skin sent sharp pains where they jabbed. The intruder pushed me out of the way to run and escape. One of the men chased after the intruder, while the other said for me to go inside, while he surveyed my home and to call the police. I locked the doors and I called the police. While I am on the phone with dispatch, I manically run around the house to double check all of the windows and doors. Suddenly, I hear a loud bang on my door. I inform the dispatch of the banging, and she informs me that police weren't there yet. I thought it might be one of the gentlemen who helped me. I go to look out the eye hole, and it's him, the intruder. He's back. He's banging on my door, screaming that I had his glasses and that he was not done with me. I absolutely freak out. The dispatcher attempts to calm me down, but I am losing my ever-loving mind. She then said, "They're pulling onto your street now. You should hear their sirens." And I did. The intruder then blasts off. One officer jumps out of the passenger side, while the car is still moving and chases after him. The second officer comes into my home, and the 2 gentlemen collects evidence, takes photos, etc. After some time of him being there, Cherry comes home and freaks out. Once the situation was explained to her, she said, "Oh my god, that could have been me." "Yeah, thanks Cherry, it's all about you." The next morning, I'm called in to identify a man that they had in custody. I pointed him out. I go into a little room, and the officer pulls out an evidence bag. He asked me if the items were mine. They were. They were my underwear and photos taken from my home. The officer informed me that the intruder had been stalking me for some time now. He estimates 3 months. He had made a nest outside of our home, on top of a hill, that overlooked into our living room and kitchen. He is a known sex offender and drug dealer. He then told me how lucky I was to get out practically unharmed, and that others weren't so lucky. When I was about 19 or 20, my very best friend in the world was dating this guy. He was really cute, funny, and sweet. I stayed with her at her apartment a lot, and he used to always come over and hang out. He lived with his great-grandmother, who was really super strict. Even though he was 18, she gave him a curfew, and if he was late, she would lock him out or call the law on him. So he always had to be home by at least like 10 p.m. Anyways, one night I was at her house and we were drinking and playing cards and stuff. He came running through the door at like 9 p.m., saying he had gotten into a fight. We didn't think anything of it really, because he wasn't exactly a golden boy and it wasn't all that surprising. But after about 12 a.m. rolled around, we were all like, "Damn, your grandma is letting you stay out this late." He ended up telling us that she was asleep and had locked him out. Again, we didn't think much of it. It happened all the time. Later on the next day, I ended up going home. My friend called me that night, crying her eyes out, telling me to look on Jail Tracker. I got on there and looked, and underneath his mugshot it said, "Murder." I was literally shocked, like, what the fuck? Who the heck did he murder? I was just there. Turns out when he came and busted through the door, he had just mangled his great-grandmother to death with a hammer. He sat there and drank with us, played cards with us, and acted like nothing had ever happened. After everyone had left, he ended up telling my friend what he had done. She acted like she was going to run off with him. She went to her room and acted like she was packing her bags up, snuck in the bathroom, and called the police. It was really scary and traumatizing for all of us, for real, but especially for her. Ended up getting sentenced to like 50 years or something like that. He tried to escape about 4 years after his sentencing, and they added even more time. So I doubt I'll ever be seeing him again. At the time of this story, I was 21 and living in a major Midwestern city, attending the university there. Having lived there for only 1 month before my story began, I had witnessed a train stop stabbing, been yelled at by a crackhead, had a homeless guy follow me and threaten to choke me outside the physics building on campus, and watched a 13 cop raid on a drug house just across the street. The area around my university is known for being rough and has a notoriously high rate of crime. We would get a few texts a week from the campus police saying things like there had been a robbery, a break-in, an assault, stalkings, attempted kidnappings, etc. I always ignored these texts, thinking foolishly that I would never be a victim because I was quote-unquote smart enough to stay out of trouble, not go out alone late at night, all the cliches. I seriously regret this behavior now, and to anyone listening to this, please never think that you're 100% safe, no matter your level of preparedness. Always do your best to stay observant and careful. The first incident wasn't too unusual. I was just a block or two from my apartment building one day in the early evening. It was still light outside. I was walking my dog Sesame, a cute Shiba Inu who just looks like a fluffy, goofy puppy and has never been frightening or particularly protective in his life. As I was heading back home, I passed a small parking lot and in it a large van. I could see a man in his early 60s sitting in the driver's seat smoking a cigarette. He was staring at me. As I passed, he actually leaned out of his car and called out to me. "Hey, you there, that's a cute dog, what's his name?" I should mention that this isn't even my first story like this. I have a pretty intense fear of strangers and actually struggle with PTSD from other incidents in my life. Being pretty wary for this reason, I ignored him and just walked faster. I heard a car door shut behind me and turned quickly to see that he had gotten out of his van and was slowly walking towards me. He called out to me again. "Hey baby, I just want to see your dog. Come back." His phrasing pissed me off and I gripped my dog's leash and started to speed walk away from him, starting to feel nervous. My heart was beginning to pound, but I kept telling myself over and over that I was overreacting and it was just my paranoia acting up and there was nothing to worry about. Boy, was I wrong. I managed to turn the corner and was about to cross the final park before getting to my apartment. In my fear over the van guy, I wasn't paying attention as much as I usually do to what was in front of me. I looked back over my shoulder and the guy had stopped following me. He was, however, standing in the middle of the sidewalk with a huge creepy grin on his face. I whirled back around with my eyes glued to my building. I only needed to walk another half a block and I'd be home. I was waiting to get away from him and his creepy van. Just when I thought I was safe, a group of 5 or 6 men came from the side of the park I wasn't watching. They were all tall and intimidating in stature, and all of them were laughing and looking right at me. Out of the corner of my eye, the van guy had started walking towards me as well. I remember he was whistling. I again picked up my pace and desperately searched for my keys in my pocket as I hurried to the door. The group of men then veered towards me, partially cutting me off, and in all my stupid politeness, I stopped. They grinned at me with sick, perverted smiles, obviously checking me out. Looking up and down my body, it made me sick. I tried not to panic and inched closer to my apartment. "Hey, what's your name? Where are you going? What's your Snapchat? Is that your apartment? Can we come over? Do you smoke?" They all barraged me with questions, one after another. I tried to refuse them, stammering, no thank you, as I saw the van guy come and join their group, leering at me. While I inched away, they inched closer. One of them reached out for me, his fingers actually touching my arm. I leapt back, trying to not start crying, but Sesame suddenly lunged at them. His teeth bared a horrifying snarl ripping from his throat. Every bit of a cute Shiba personality was gone, and he was looking like he wanted to tear one of these guys' throats out. It startled him enough that I was able to turn and sprint the final distance to my building, locking the door behind me. I fell to the floor inside my building, hugging Sesame. However, the entire front of my building was glass, and to my horror and disbelief, the group of men came and stood in front of the windows, grinning at me and laughing, and making kissy faces and lewd gestures at me. The apartment manager came out and called the cops on them, but they ran away. I made it back home and scrubbed myself in the shower, crying and shaking with fear. Sesame got a special dinner that evening, and I kept telling myself that they just wanted to mess with me, that I was never in any real danger. About a month later, when I had finally managed to be able to walk outside my apartment without severe anxiety, I was actually planning on moving a bit farther away from campus. It was still going to be in a sketchy neighborhood, but the thought of those men knowing where I lived kept me up at night. My apartment actually hired a security guard to be there 24/7 after someone had broken into the building, smashed all the windows, and destroyed some of the furniture, and even stole a bunch of bikes. Of course, my bike got stolen. Anyways, I was heading home from class, and it was a beautiful day. I actually felt pretty happy for once, and popped my earbuds in the last few blocks before I got home. After a block or so, I started to feel like someone was watching me. My palms started sweating. I glanced behind me, trying not to look obvious, and a tall man was about 20 feet behind me, staring straight at me. I snapped my head back around and ripped out my earbuds. No, I thought. It can't be one of them. I was just jumping to conclusions, giving my anxiety disorder and paranoia surely. There was something familiar about him. My heart started racing, as I hoped to God the others weren't waiting for me around the corner of my building, ready to jump me. I walked faster, wishing Sesame was with me. I was too afraid to look back at him as I fumbled with my keys and wrenched the door open as hard as I could. This turned out to be a crucial mistake. As I ran to the elevator, trying to breathe a sigh of relief, I saw with absolute horror that the man had caught the door I had thrown wide open and was slowly coming into the building with me. He paused, standing away from me, but close enough that I could hear his ragged breathing and smell alcohol coming off of him. My heart was thudding in my chest now, and I struggled to think clearly. The apartment manager was already home for the day, and I was completely alone in the lobby. There were no other doors out of that room, and the stranger was blocking my way to the door. The security guard supposed to be keeping an eye on the building was nowhere to be seen. The elevator came, and I tried to run into it and slam my hand over the door close button as fast as I could. I pushed my floor button and huddled into the far corner of the elevator. I started to once again try to catch my breath, but right when the door was almost closed, he stuck his hand in. I couldn't believe it. He waited until the door was just about closed, and then he stopped it. He was standing close enough that there was no way that was a mistake. My stomach dropped, and a suffocating sense of dread crept in. I kept my hand down as he joined me. My desperate hope that he was just a dirty, drunken resident of the building was dashed when he didn't press any buttons. I don't know why I didn't run out of the elevator or try to leave the building again. I was paralyzed with fear, and all I could do was watch the door close and seal my fate. The elevator was filled with the stench of alcohol and BO. If I wasn't so terrified, I may have gagged. It was nauseating. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't move. I tried to scream at myself in my head to press the wrong button and try to escape him, but I was completely petrified. He leaned closer to me, and I heard him breathe in deeply and very quietly sigh, like he was content. I felt tears well in my eyes, and the seconds it took to reach the top floor where I lived felt like hours. I saw no way I could escape this sick, drunk guy who was smelling me. In the reflection of the elevator walls, I could make out his disgusting smile. He was staring directly at me with his hands in his pockets, clearly holding on to something. I'm not religious, but I prayed that I would make it to my door in time. I realized he probably wasn't going to attack me in the elevator. There was a large camera in the ceiling. I looked up at it, feeling a tear spill out of my eye as I did so, hoping that whoever saw the tape eventually would identify this man. The worst part of all of this is that I've trained in martial arts and self-defense since I was about 8 years old. I thought of myself as stronger and braver than I was acting. I should know what to do. I should be strong enough to do it. No matter how many times I had disarmed, thrown, or choked out attackers in the studio, nothing totally prepares you for the dread of a real-life situation. As the elevator reached my floor, I managed to snap out of my stupor long enough to dash through the door and run to my apartment unit. I nearly missed the keyhole, but I threw open my door. I was nearly through when my backpack snagged on the outside handle of the door, trapping me. I heard the man walking quickly to my door, a low chuckle building in his throat as he watched me panic and struggle to get free. I felt like a mouse being watched by a cat, trapped and helpless, so close to escaping. I finally gave up and shoved my arms through the straps, abandoning my backpack. As I did so, the man suddenly reached out for me. I was able to slam the door shut, deadbolting it. The gust of air from the door slamming brought his disgusting smell in with me, and in my terror and disgust, I retched violently. I looked through the peephole. He was staring right at me, pressing his forehead against the door, his mouth bent in a furious scowl. He swore at me and ripped my backpack off the handle of the door, slamming it to the ground. I winced as I heard my laptop thud. I was still too terrified to say anything, but I grabbed the knife I kept by my door in my hand, ready if he tried anything. After a few minutes of staring at my door, jiggling the handle, and licking the peephole, and making obscene motions at it, he unzipped my backpack, dumping its contents on the floor. He picked up my bag, sniffing it, and leering at the peephole as he did so, like he knew I was watching him. I couldn't look away, again paralyzed in fear. Finally, he left, using the elevator visible from my door like nothing had happened. I continued to stare at all the people for what felt like an eternity, then finally called the apartment manager, feeling my anger sinking in that the security guard hadn't been anywhere in sight, not paying attention. Turns out he had fallen asleep eating Taco Bell and watching movies on his phone. He was only 10 feet away from the elevator the entire time, sleeping in the office behind a closed door. They fired him, but the creepy guy was never caught, and neither were any of the others. I don't even know for sure if this man was part of the original group. I was honestly too terrified to look at their faces during the first incident. I moved out of my apartment a week later, staying with my boyfriend at the time for the remainder of my lease, and keeping Sesame with me at all times when possible. A few more things happened while I lived in that city, from having to call in a gunfight from outside my new apartment window, to having to pick up my friend who was being followed by a van, to having to evacuate during an arson incident. There are nice things about that city too, but during my time there, besides learning the police department was absolutely useless and corrupt, to nearly escaping with my life multiple times. I couldn't be happier to be far, far away from there, and doing a lot better with my fear and anxiety.